All right, so this lab, our goal is to determine the products and the reactants of a combustion reaction. So just to frame this whole thing, basically everything you did was to prove either a reactant or a product of combustion. So let's just remind you what the reactants are. So reactants are what you put together in a reaction. So it's what's required in order for combustion to occur. So I'm going to say this is reactant 1 plus reactant 2 plus reactant 3 yields product 1 plus product 2 plus product 3. So basically we want to figure out what's reactant 1, what's reactant 2, what's reactant 3, what's product 1, what's product 2, and product 3. Like that's what we want to figure out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each section and talk about what we were supposed to see and what it might indicate in terms of the reactants and products. So remember, this side's reactants. It's what you kind of need for the reaction to occur. This is the products. This is what is produced due to combustion. Okay, it's what's produced due to combustion. All right, so just keep that in mind. Let's go to the first one. So the first one talks about mass change. And so what you'll notice is that the mass of the candle went down or decreased from when you started to when you finished in one day, and so during one period. And so the question is, why did the mass change? And so what you should have noticed was how your candle grew shorter and shorter. And what was going on was the candle was actually using the wax. And so the wax, called paraffin wax, is fuel for the flame. And so the first thing we learned is, as you can tell, because the mass decreased, we know that fuel was used. That fuel was the wax. And so fuel is one of your reactants. There's different types of fuels. For example, in the Bunsen burner, it's natural gas that is used as fuel, that is burned. In a campfire, it's wood. In this case, it was the wax. So let's go look at procedure B1. So in procedure B1, you took a look at a candle flame in the beaker, and you saw how long it took to extinguish. And so hopefully what you determined there was one of the reactants. What you should have seen was that the bigger beaker required more time for the flame to extinguish. And this probably is because that there's more air, specifically oxygen. And so what you've determined is that oxygen is one of the reactants. So oxygen, or O2, is one of the reactants. And it makes sense, if there's more oxygen in the bigger beaker, the flame will last longer. But once that oxygen is used up, the flame can no longer exist, or the combustion reaction can no longer occur. So we know oxygen to be one of the reactants. The magic candle trick was interesting. So what you should have seen was that when the candle was blown out, you had to smoke. And so the question is, like, what's in that smoke? Well, we learned in the Bunsen burner lab that the candle flame, because it's orange, is inefficient, meaning it doesn't have enough oxygen in that particular area, and so not all the fuel is being used up. So in the smoke is fuel, is unused fuel that isn't able to react with the oxygen, which we found to be one of the reactants. Well, if you light or you spark one of these fuel, or so if you add heat, you can actually reignite the combustion reaction. You can start the combustion reaction because you have heat, you have fuel, and in the air around here, right, in the air here, you have oxygen. And so you have the three things necessary to start a fire. So that's how that candle, even though, and so when you lit this fuel, it kind of, the fuel trail was here, right? And so the fire spread backwards back to the wick. And remember, the wick is the place where the wax is coming out, right? Or the fuel is being released. Okay. The copper coil is interesting, actually. So the copper coil proves a couple things. The first is the copper coil. Well, you should notice when you put the copper coil over the flame kind of died down, or it got smaller. And so it proves actually what the copper coil does is the copper coil is conductive. It can conduct heat. And so when you put the copper coil around, so when you put the copper coil, so we have heat being released, right? So the copper coil, if I can draw it like this, right? Not the greatest drawing, but the copper coil absorbs the heat. It's a good conductor of heat. And so what you should notice is that when the copper coil removes that heat or absorbs that heat, there's no other heat around. And so the flame kind of flickers or it gets smaller. And so what it kind of tells you is that if you remove heat and the flame kind of goes out, that means that heat is one of the reactants. You might think of it as one of the products, or sorry, one of the, like you might think of it as like the match or sparker or some kind of spark. But really what it is you're creating heat so that the flame or the heat can interact with the oxygen and the fuel, okay? And if you remove the heat from the candle by absorbing it using the copper coil, the flame gets smaller or weaker. Cobalt chloride. Cobalt chloride, what you notice is when you first drop water on it, it turned pink. So cobalt chloride is an indicator of water. And then what you should have noticed is after you trapped the product, so you put the beaker over or the flask over the candle. And so when you did that, you trapped what was being produced, the gas that was being produced. And so so whatever gas was being produced, you got trapped here. And you'll notice that you got some condensation. I guess I'll just do it in blue. You got some condensation along the side here. Right? And so that condensation, when you applied the cobalt paper to it, so when you applied the cobalt paper, it turned pink, just like what happened when you added water to the cobalt. So what the cobalt indicates to you is that there's water inside the products, inside the beaker. And so what we wanted to know was that water is one of the products, and you determine that from the cobalt chloride. Bromothymol blue. So hopefully you saw that the bromothymol blue was when you blew in the straw, the bromothymol blue turned green. And so if you think when you exhale, one of the major components in which you exhale or gases you exhale is carbon dioxide. So bromothymol blue actually determines the presence of carbon dioxide. And so you should have noticed that when you trapped the products or what was being produced, you trapped, well, now we know we trapped water as one of our products. We also trapped carbon dioxide. So we knew that one of the products was CO2 or carbon dioxide. The reason why we knew that is because when we added bromothymol blue to it, so when we added BTB or bromothymol blue, it turned green. And remember, when bromothymol blue turns green, that indicates the presence of carbon dioxide. So one of the products was CO2. All right, and then we move to the test tube and water. So the biggest thing was, hopefully you noticed that the temperature went up. And so when the temperature up, it indicates that there's more heat energy. And so therefore one of the products was heat. And that makes sense. People build fires all the time so that you keep warm. So heat is one of the products. So what that leaves you is a reaction. And so the reaction looks like this, where you have heat. So here are your reactants. So remember, you need a spark or heat energy plus O2, which is oxygen, plus fuel. In this case, the fuel was the wax, right? And so that gives you, okay, so here's my reactant side. And then so let's talk about the product. What was produced? Well, from the Cobalt Chloride lab, water was produced. And remember, this water, like if you think about it, the water doesn't remain liquid form because it's so hot around the fire that it just vaporizes, right? It evaporates. So you got water, and that's from the Cobalt Chloride, plus CO2. CO2 was from the bromothymol blue, and you had heat. All right? Okay. The one thing I want you to notice is that because you produce heat, the flame continues on. Like if you don't keep on lighting matches and relighting a fire, right? What happens is, since one of the products of the combustion reaction is heat, that heat is used to restart another combustion reaction, and so it's kind of like a chain reaction. And so you don't need to continually restart your fire. All right, hopefully that helps.